This is a story about loyalty. In the early 1990s, Roger is playing bass in this band whose name I don't know how to pronounce. But he has this friend and bandmate named Timothy who keeps telling Roger, "You gotta be in a band with me." And Roger has almost always said yes to Timothy. He's been by his side for years, as Timothy has descended into alcoholism. He said yes to driving him to detox centers. He said yes to giving him money for food. He said yes to giving him money even when he knew it was going to alcohol. But finally he realizes that his friend is killing himself. And so he says no. He said, "I'll still keep playing music with you, but I'm not going to take it seriously, and I'm not going to join your band officially until you can show me you can stay sober for 1 year." He told Timothy, "I'm tired of you breaking my heart." Roger and Timothy had known each other since they were kids. They both grew up in this town in Northern California called Albany, and they had met in the early 70s when they were around 7 years old, but they remained just acquaintances until high school. At Albany High School, they found themselves in the same music class, and in 1983 they decided to enter the school talent show, this thing called the Cougar Follies, and they played a cover of Elvis's Blue Suede Shoes. Everybody at their school thought they were weirdos, but after that, Roger and Timothy kept playing together. At one point, they were playing in this band together with Roger on bass and Timothy on guitar, and they were having this really bad band practice. And Roger and Timothy went upstairs and were like, "What is going on with these other guys in the band? They're fucking knuckleheads." And that's when Roger and Timothy really made a connection. They realized that they were on the same team. Even though they were playing in a punk band, they were two musicians that took their music seriously. Roger had played in his school band. He'd played trumpet and baritone horn and trombone, but he found himself drawn to the bass. He was inspired by John Entwistle from The Who, but also loved punk rock bassists like John Doe from X and Horace Panter from The Specials. Roger and Timothy had been in this band together called The Noise, which turned into a band called Basic Radio, but then the two of them got kicked out of Basic Radio, and they found themselves without a band at a really bad time because a new music venue had opened up in the East Bay near where they lived. It was a venue called 924 Gilman Street. Before that, there hadn't really been a consistent place for punk bands to play. Roger and Timothy were both there on opening night, December 31st, 1986. Gilman Street was something different. It was an all-ages venue. There was no alcohol allowed, and also no racism, no sexism, no homophobia. It was all volunteer run. The great thing for two working class kids like Roger and Timothy is that you could get into shows for free as long as you helped out. Timothy swept up after the shows and Roger took the garbage to the dump. It wasn't just a place to see bands, it was a place for kids to gather who were desperate to be a part of something. Immediately, Roger and Timothy wanted to put together a new band so they could play at Gilman. One day at a Berkeley BART station, Timothy found himself talking to this other Gilman Street regular named Jesse. They'd known each other since 1982 when they were both in different bands. And now Timothy asked Jesse if he wanted to start something new. They were both into punk bands like The Clash, The Ramones, Stiff Little Fingers. Timothy was also really into two-tone ska bands like The Specials and The Beat, and so that influence would also eventually work its way into the music. They found a drummer named Dave Mello, who was also from Albany. The band played their first show in Dave's garage, but then they played their second show at Gilman Street. And the Gilman Street crowd immediately connected with this band. In 1987, there were tons of great bands at Gilman Street. Crimp Shrine, Isocracy, The Mr. T Experience, Sweet Baby Jesus, No Use for a Name. But this band quickly became a favorite. The band with Jesse Michaels on vocals, Timothy Armstrong or Lint on guitar, Dave Mello on drums, and Roger Matthew Freeman, who went by his middle name Matt, on bass, took their name from an old name that Isocracy had used, Operation Ivy. In the fall of 1987, Operation Ivy made their first recording for this legendary double 7-inch called Turn It Around. It was funded by Maximum Rock and Roll, which was a newspaper whose founder had been instrumental in starting Gilman Street, and it was put together by this guy named David Hayes. The success of this 7-inch was part of what made David Hayes and this other musician and Gilman Street regular, Larry Livermore, start a record label to try to capture the Gilman Street scene called Lookout Records. One of Lookout's first releases was an EP from Operation Ivy. When Larry first went to Tim Armstrong and told him that they were going to press 1,000 copies of the EP, Tim thought he was crazy, and Larry was a little worried that he was crazy too. But then the EP sold out in a month. Operation Ivy was so popular that Lookout thought they could actually go on a nationwide tour. They became the first Gilman Street band to go on tour. They didn't have a van to tour in, so they all packed into a 1969 Chrysler Newport. They went out on the road for 6 weeks. sometimes playing shows for 3 people in a living room, sometimes playing to packed clubs full of kids who knew all of their songs. They had to sleep on people's floors and camp out, but Tim said that this was the pinnacle. He was in a band that had a record that was going on tour. He didn't think anything could get better than that. When they got back from tour, the band wanted to start working on a full-length album. But as they worked on the album through 1988 and into 1989, things were different around Gilman Street. Major record labels had come looking for bands to sign. The band Sweet Baby Jesus, who changed their name to Sweet Baby, became the first of the bands to sign to a major label. The band felt like it wasn't fun anymore. Something had changed. And so on May 28, 1989, Operation Ivy booked a show at Gilman Street that would be their record release show and their last show. One of the opening bands was a band from the Gilman Street scene that worshipped Operation Ivy called Green Day. Gilman Street only held 300 people, and 1,000 people packed into the club that night. After Operation Ivy broke up, even though Tim said it was a mutual thing, after a while it set in that he didn't have a band. And those times playing with Operation Ivy had been the happiest of his life. He had not had the best upbringing, his father was an alcoholic, and Tim found himself drinking more and more. After Operation Ivy, Tim and Matt kept trying to put bands together. They started a band called Downfall, one called Generator, one called Dance Hall Crashers that did go on to be successful after they left. But Tim's alcoholism kept ruining all of these projects. Tim had been living with his mom in Albany, but eventually even she got fed up and kicked him out of the house. And it seemed like the only person that was still by his side was Matt. But Matt told him that he had to get sober. So finally Tim moved into this Salvation Army shelter. He worked for them in exchange for a bed, and he got sober. And then finally, after a year sober, he went to Matt and said, "Let's do this. Let's get serious about this new band." Matt said he immediately quit his other band. The two of them found a drummer, Brett Reed, and started playing shows as Rancid. The new band signed with the independent label Epitaph Records and released their debut album, just called Rancid, in 1993. After playing as a 3-piece for a while, Rancid thought they should get another guitar player. They played some shows with Billy Joe Armstrong from Green Day, no relation, by the way, to Tim Armstrong. And he said he loved the band, he had a good time playing with them, but he kind of had to focus on Green Day. So that's when Tim met Lars Fredriksson. With Lars on second guitar and also on vocals, the band started working on their second album, Let's Go. This album was released in 1994, which ended up being a huge year for bands who had played at Gilman Street. Both Green Day and the Southern California band The Offspring had huge albums this year. One of the singles from Let's Go, a song called Salvation, which Tim had written about his time living and working with the Salvation Army, started getting played on the radio, and the video started getting played on MTV. The band started getting tons of attention from major labels, even more than the attention that had broken up Operation Ivy. Famously, Madonna even came to one of their shows to try to get them to sign with her label Maverick. But in the end, Rancid turned all the major labels down, and they stuck with Epitaph. Their next record, 1995's And Out Come the Wolves, was their biggest record ever. But Rancid is still together. They released their 10th album together last year, and Tim has said that there's nothing better than being on stage with his friends. He said he looks over at Lars, and he looks over at Matt, and that's the safest place in the world.